Please be advised, this episode does have content that some may find distressing. As always, listener discretion is advised and it is not suitable for anyone under the age of 13.
Hello and welcome to episode 46 of It's Murder Up North. The podcast is quickly approaching its first birthday, and I would love to hear your thoughts on how we should mark this celebration. Please feel free to contact me on Facebook on the Murder Up North discussion group, or on Twitter at Murder Up North. I would love to hear your suggestions. Now to my podcast of the week. It is a brand new show called Crime Obscene, hosted by the wonderful Aaron. He has produced 2 amazing episodes so far, and I think with the support of our great true crime community, his show is going to be very successful. Here is a sneak peek.
Hello, I'm Aaron, the host of Crime Obscene, a monthly true crime podcast that focuses on unsolved murders, disappearances, and beyond from around the world, like the disappearance and suspected homicide of Deirdre Jacob, what happened to Jaliek Rainwalker, and the next episode to be released, Where is Jennifer Kessie? You can find Crime Obscene on all your favourite podcatchers, and we're on social media at Crime Obscene Podcast.
Now, let's head to the episode. The second longest river in Europe, the River Danube, springs from a source in the Black Forest of Germany. Winding its way southeast through the continent of Europe, it cuts a path through the major cities of Budapest and Vienna, before it opens out into the Black Sea. It is in Austria, on the banks of the River Danube, that the grave of a man whom I have been unable to name was discovered, after he had gone missing in 1959 while travelling down the river. Austrian police treated the traveller's disappearance as suspicious, and it wasn't long before they identified their prime suspect, the missing man's business partner and friend. The issue was that at the time, they were unable to prove that the business partner had any involvement in his friend's disappearance, mainly because the man refused to acknowledge any wrongdoing, and they had no body to confirm that a murder had taken place. Therefore, despite the friend being arrested and charged, the police were unable to bring the case to court. One piece of evidence that had been recovered during a search of the suspect's property was a pair of boots that were coated in mud. Investigators took an unusual step of sending samples of this mud to the University of Vienna, where Wilhelm Klaus, who specialised in the study of pollen and spores, which is known as paleontology, a discipline commonly used in archaeological research. Upon inspecting the samples, Wilhelm Klaus was able to identify a number of pollen types, which had originated from 3 species of tree, the spruce, willow, and alder. He also discovered a fossilised pollen, which proved to be key to the investigation, as from this Klaus was able to pinpoint an area these contributions were most likely to be found. He directed investigators to an area near the Danube, which lay north of Vienna, the only place all the pollen types could be found together. The suspect was asked about this area, and during questioning he admitted to murdering his friend. He subsequently led them to the spot where he had buried the body. This is reported to be the first case in which the expertise of a paleontologist was utilised during a criminal investigation. Over the years, the science has been improved. In the UK, it has contributed to the investigations of high-profile cases, such as the Soham murders, in which 10-year-old Holly Wells and her friend Jessica Chapman were murdered by their school caretaker. It was paleontologist Professor Wiltshire who assisted in the Soham investigation, and it would be her expertise that would help Humberside Police solve the 1984 murder of 9-year-old Christopher Laverack. I first became aware of Christopher's case having watched an episode of Crime Watch UK, a TV series which I've mentioned previously, in particular in regards to the murder of Shirley Leach at Bury bus station. The show allowed police forces around the country to appeal directly to the public, in hopes that the leads generated would help solve difficult cases. Although it has now been cancelled, the series has proven to be a valuable source of information for the podcast, and while watching I cannot help Google to see whether the cases have had a resolution. 5 months before Christopher's case appeared on Crime Watch, the shy boy had finished school on Friday the 9th of March 1984. He waved goodbye to his friends in the schoolyard and told them he would see them on Monday. At 10 to 7 that evening, Christopher's mum and stepdad pulled up outside his sister's semi-detached house. The engine had barely been switched off when the little boy raced from the car and scurried under his sister's arm as she opened the front door, almost knocking her flying as he took a sharp right into the living room and enthusiastically threw himself on the rug in front of the television. His bright blue eyes stared widely at the television screen, watching in amazement as the opening credits began to play. With wonderment, he admired the awe-inspiring stunts of Lee Majors in the role of the Fall Guy. Christopher was enthralled by the strength and bravery of the unknown stuntman, and as his mum entered the room talking with his sister, he turned the volume knob to drown out their conversation. The 9-year-old's parents were divorced, and Christopher lived with his mum Pamela and stepfather Brian in the village of Anleby, which lay to the west of the city of Hull, and north of Hessel, which is where William Burkitt murdered 3 women in the 1920s and 30s, as well as being where Keith Slater was murdered on his doorstep. Due to his parents' separation, Christopher alternated his weekends between his father's house and his sister Kim's house at No. 7 Harpen Grove, which was a 2-bedroom semi-detached property on a council estate, set back from the road with a small front garden. As you stepped through the front door, the enclosed staircase reached up to the first floor, while to the right was the living room, which led directly into the kitchen, through which the back garden could be accessed. Christopher's sister Kim lived in the home with her husband Stephen and her 15-month-old son Martin. As always on a Friday night, Kim would leave for work at 10 to 8. She worked as a barmaid at the Crown Pub on Marfleet Road, which was approximately 1 minute drive or 6 minutes walk away from the house on Harpen Grove. With Christopher still mesmerised by the television, his mother bent down and kissed him on the head. She whispered for him to be good and made her way out the door, followed by her husband and Kim, who they were going to drop off at work. By 9 p.m, baby Martin was asleep in his cot upstairs, while Stephen had continued to sit in the living room watching television with Christopher. Satisfied that the baby was settled, Stephen told Christopher he was going to the Crown Pub for a drink, and inquired whether his brother-in-law wanted anything. The fair-haired boy turned and politely asked for a packet of cheese and onion crisps. Stephen nodded and told the 9-year-old he would be back soon. Christopher was a sensible boy, who knew not to open the door to strangers. It is not stated whether it was a regular occurrence for Christopher to be left alone with the baby, and if it was a regular occurrence, who else may have known this was the case? At around 10 p.m, Stephen finished his pint. He ordered 2 packets of crisps and headed home. He opened the front door, to the sound of the baby crying upstairs. Going to Martin's cot, the father picked up his son to soothe him, gently bouncing him in his arms as he headed back down the staircase and into the living room. As soon as he opened the door, he noticed a space where the TV should have been, and it was evident it had been violently ripped from the wall, causing the wire to snap while leaving the plug still in the socket. Concerned, Stephen shouted Christopher's name. He searched the house for the 9-year-old, but his efforts proved fruitless. Christopher was gone, and other than the television, nothing else appeared to be missing or disturbed. In 1984, not every household had a telephone, so Stephen first called at his neighbour's home, where an elderly couple lived. They did have a telephone, but when he received no response, he was forced to take his baby son to the Crown Pub, a 5-minute walk away, where he told his wife that Christopher was missing, and they used the phone at the pub to contact the police. It had already grown dark, but the police responded swiftly. They were instantly concerned regarding the circumstances of Christopher's disappearance. Despite the fact the front door had been left unlocked, Christopher was not the kind of child to open the door to anyone he didn't know. There was also no signs of the door being forced open or a struggle. Had it not been for the missing television, it would have been easy for police to consider that the 9-year-old boy had left the house of his own accord. Investigators concluded that the TV was taken to make it appear as though there had been a robbery, when it was possible that Christopher had been the actual target. It had been theorised early in the search that Christopher may have been taken by someone he knew and trusted, given the fact that there was no evidence that the little boy had put up a fight. As dawn broke on the morning of the 10th of March, a full-scale search for the missing 9-year-old was underway, the heavy rain and cold conditions adding to the sense of urgency. It was an extensive operation, which involved scouring waste ground, empty properties and houses in the area. The house on Harpen Grove sat amongst a large housing estate, roughly 2.5 miles east of Hull city centre. The estate also had a number of parks, allotments and 2 cemeteries close by. To the west of the estate was the Holderness Drain, a waterway constructed in the 1700s to prevent the land becoming waterlogged. This flowed south into the River Humber, where the city's docks are located. In the 1980s, the skyline to the south of Harpen Grove would have been dominated by the factories and cranes of industry. All these areas had to be considered in the search. The first lead came from the elderly neighbour whom Stephen had attempted to rouse so he could use her phone. The elderly lady stated that at about 9:15 she had been caring for her ill husband, when she heard a car pull up outside the house. She told officers that she looked out the window and found it strange that the driver had left the headlights on. The neighbour continued to explain that shortly after the car had pulled up she heard a voice outside her neighbour's house. The person was calling for Stephen to answer the door, stating that they needed to speak to him. Unfortunately, from her vantage point, this neighbour was unable to see the person, but was able to confirm it was a male voice. With regards to the vehicle, due to it being dark, the elderly neighbour was only able to provide investigators with an idea of the shape of the vehicle, and could not clarify its colour, make or model. Due to the thin partition walls between the 2 houses, the elderly lady was able to hear the neighbour's front door being opened, but did not hear any conversation or sounds of someone in distress. Following this, the woman returned to tend to her husband. She heard no further noises from next door, but did hear the car driving away not long after it had arrived. This witness statement cemented the theory that Christopher had probably left the property of his own accord, with someone he clearly trusted. This person had taken advantage of the hour window in which Stephen had left the house, leading to speculation that this person may have been watching or was aware of this routine. The other alternative was that this was an opportunistic kidnapping, in which the perpetrator had called at the home, expecting to find Stephen, yet when they discovered that Christopher was home alone, they took him and the television. Investigators hoped that the missing television set would be key to helping them learn the identity of the perpetrator, and due to the violent nature in which it had been ripped from the wall, they knew that the set would either have been discarded, sold as damaged, or alternatively, the thief had taken it to have a new cable fitted. People in the Hull area were asked to be on the lookout for the TV set. Memos were dispatched to local repair shops, and officers made inquiries at pubs to see whether someone may have purchased this set from another patron. But despite all their best efforts, the television set was never located. 2 days after Christopher's disappearance, police divers began searching the stretch of water called Holderness Drain, which was less than a minute away from Christopher's sister's house on Harpen Grove. This search was called off just after midday, when Hull Police received a call from a man who had been out walking his dog along the banks of Beverley Beck when he had come across a bag floating in the water, with what appeared to be a body inside. Beverley Beck, now popular for fishing and leisure boats, was approximately 30 minutes north of Harpen Grove, and was primarily lined by industrial units and factories, with the towpath utilised by mainly dog walkers and people travelling to and from work. The package in the river was a large white plastic bag, used to hold carpet underlay, into which the body had been placed, and an attempt had been made to weigh it down with an ornamental brick. Following the discovery of the remains, Pamela Crawley made the journey to the hospital to identify her son. She was accompanied by her brother Melvin. She could hardly bear to look at Christopher, with his blonde locks tangled and dirty. It was his characteristic freckles that graced his cheeks and nose that made her realise that the child before her was her 9-year-old son. Comforted by her brother, Pamela confirmed what investigators already suspected. When Christopher's body was examined by the pathologist, it was determined that he had likely been killed and placed in the water on the night he had disappeared. The little boy's jeans were unfastened, his shoelaces untied, and there were signs of dirt and tears on his clothing. It was evident that Christopher had been sexually assaulted, during which his attacker had bitten him on the buttock, before beating the 9-year-old boy about the head, inflicting several injuries, and causing his death. The pathologist determined that there was a high probability that the ornamental brick found with the body was the murder weapon. However, due to the length of time the body had been in the water, there was evidence that had been compromised, and the limitations regarding forensic technologies at the time meant that no further evidence could be recovered, but samples were taken and placed in storage. With the limited clues they had to go on, detectives knew they were looking for a male, who was most likely known to Christopher, and had access to a vehicle which had an elongated bonnet and rounded boot. So their attention turned to people who Christopher would have known. This included family and friends. They started with immediate family, Christopher's biological father, who he obviously would have trusted, and he was one of the first people to be looked into. However, he lived too far away for it to have been feasible for him to make the journey. Also, he had an alibi, which was corroborated by several people. Detectives looked into the stepfather, Brian, whom Christopher's mother had married the previous year. However, he had been with Pamela all night, and the couple had been visiting relatives at the time Christopher was believed to have been taken, to which they had numerous people who could vouch for their whereabouts. Focus turned to Stephen, the husband of Christopher's sister, who had been tasked with looking after the 9-year-old boy that night. However, he did not have access to a vehicle, and his movements were verified by people who saw him at the pub at the time Christopher went missing. But these witnesses did remark that Stephen seemed to be trying to draw attention to his presence. As the last person to have seen Christopher, police brought Stephen in for questioning on several occasions, but they were unable to connect him to the murder. But he was never completely disregarded as a potential suspect. 5 months into the investigation with no new leads, the police approached the series Crime Watch UK, which showed a reconstruction of the night Christopher went missing, in the hopes that it would help generate more leads. The audience were not only shown a timeline of events leading up to Christopher being taken, a replica of the carpet underlay bag was displayed, a silhouette of the car seen by the neighbour was shown, along with an identical model of the television set that had been taken. They also appealed for witnesses who may have seen a vehicle or an individual near the house that night, or near to where the body was found, particularly on the towpath that ran alongside the beck, or a road bridge that crossed the beck, on which someone may have stopped to dispose of the body. It was also revealed that they had found barley particles on Christopher's clothing, and theorised that the child had possibly been taken to or killed in a winter barley field. With this in mind, they asked farmers to be vigilant and report anything unusual that they found in their fields. Unfortunately, although they received tips from many well-meaning members of the public, detectives were finding that the case was growing cold, as one lead after the next led them nowhere. In the years that followed, numerous appeals were made and reward money was offered. One of the most substantial rewards was offered by the Serious Crimes Assistance Reward Fund, who put forward £100,000 in November 1986. But this life-changing amount did not generate any information that would help solve the case. During the 1990s, the stretch of Beverley Beck in which Christopher's remains were found was drained and dredged, as part of a building project. Investigators hoped that this new activity would uncover evidence pertaining to the case, in particular the missing television. However, despite extensive searches, their efforts led nowhere. In 1999, Christopher Laverack would have celebrated his 25th birthday, with the family left wondering what kind of man the shy little boy would have become. But the main question was still unanswered: who had taken him from them? A new hope rose in the family when a letter was received. It consisted of a detailed 17-page description of what had happened to Christopher on the night of March the 9th, 1984. With a Bradford postmark, and the writer going by the name Rex, this was potentially a huge lead. Their letter was analysed closely, and the family were disheartened to learn that the letter had been typed up on a computer, so no handwriting comparisons could be made. The information within the letter itself was readily available to the public, with no new insights that only the actual perpetrator would know, and some of the details on the case were incorrect, leading to the conclusion that this letter was a hoax. As far as I am aware, the author of this letter was never traced, and sadly it is not uncommon for hoax letters and phone calls to be sent to the families of people who have been murdered or are missing. Following the discovery that this letter had no connection to the case, Christopher's mother made a fresh appeal for help, pleading, quote, "It will all come out eventually. I think conscience will be getting to someone. The police will not give up on this because no one likes an unsolved case, especially not this one." It wouldn't be until the start of the millennium that the case would be reviewed, when new information came to light, in the form of sexual abuse allegations made by a number of boys against one individual. Reopening the investigation in 2001, Detective Inspector Conrad Owen stated that the accused had been assaulting boys in the years after Christopher's murder, which, quote, shows he was seen as a dependable, trustworthy character. He succeeded in deceiving 4 sets of parents into thinking he was a lovable uncle character, and he managed to pull that off until things started to fall apart in 2001. Then, one allegation just came after another, end quote. This man had been a potential suspect back in 1984. He lived on Grantley Grove, which was significant, as not only was this just 10 minutes away from the house on Harpham Grove, but was also in close proximity to the crime pub, where Kim worked. In fact, in order to reach the home where Christopher was taken, the perpetrator would have had to cross the intersection where the pub stands. It was possible that the perpetrator had seen Stephen in the pub that night and therefore knew that Christopher was home alone. Other circumstantial details included the fact that this man was known to have been a regular visitor to the home of Kim and Stephen. He owned a vehicle that had a similar silhouette to the one described by the neighbour, and he worked in a factory which sat beside Beverly Beck, close to the location Christopher's body was found. The 9-year-old boy would have trusted this man, just as his mother had when she turned to him for comfort, when she had to identify Christopher's remains. He was her brother, Melvin. During the review of Christopher's case, investigators learned that Melvin did not have a solid alibi for the night of the murder. However, despite him appearing like a viable suspect, the evidence to prove he was responsible just didn't exist, so no arrest was made. There was one key aspect that potentially connected Christopher's murder to the sexual abuse allegations made against Melvin. It was reported by the 4 boys he abused that he would bite them on the buttocks, which was consistent with what Christopher's killer had done. Melvin was questioned by police in 2002, and although it is reported he told lies to investigators, and there was circumstantial evidence that could connect him to the murder, it wasn't enough to press charges against him. In 2003, Melvin was arrested and went to court regarding the sexual abuse allegations, in which it was reported he had abused 4 boys. The result of the trial led to him being sentenced to 7.5 years in prison. Since the case had been reopened in 2001, the police had continued to re-examine Christopher's case. They sought to find new evidence that could lead to the identity of the suspect, and hoped that advances in technology would help them bring the killer to justice. It wouldn't be until 2006 when Humberside Police were selected as one of 4 police forces to trial a new type of forensics, known as DNA boost technology, a new form of computer software which allowed for the division of DNA in samples that may have been previously deemed too contaminated to use. It was hoped that this new development would allow scientists to identify and separate multiple DNA contributors. It had previously been used in low-level crimes such as burglary, but it was hoped it could help in the resolution of more serious crimes. In total, 2,000 samples were used across the 4 selected forces, one of which was a sample recovered from Christopher Laverack's case. Results in early 2006 gave police hope that they could now press charges against Melvin Reed, and in May they arrested the 63-year-old, who was still serving his prison sentence, yet once again they were forced to place him on unconditional bail, pending further investigation. Determined to close the case, police released new information regarding the murder. During fresh appeals, they released images of items recovered as evidence, including a piece of wire normally found in the wiring of doorbells and speaker systems, which had been used to secure the carpet bag, and the brick that had been found with the body and was believed to have been the murder weapon. Detective Superintendent Ray Higgins, who was leading the investigation, theorised that, quote, "The murderer must have known about the location of Beverly Beck. He had gone there. He has felt safe there. He has disposed of the body there. He has had access to the carpet bag. It has been tied with a bell wire." The investigation was dealt a major blow in 2008, when just 3 weeks before he was due to be released from prison, the prime suspect died of cancer. However, this setback did not prevent Humberside Police from proceeding with the investigation, and they made the decision to name Christopher Laverack's uncle as the man they suspected of committing the crime. In a statement, Detective Superintendent Ray Higgins said, "We have made the decision to confirm Melvin Reed was indeed a suspect in the investigation. It is an investigation that remains open and will continue to do so until any hope of resolution is completely gone. We have worked tirelessly on this since his death, and that situation will not change as a result of Melvin Reed's death." The investigation had continued in earnest, re-examining every piece of evidence, with the aim that they could build a strong enough argument to prove Reed's guilt. D.S. Higgins continued to explain, "We had all the bad character evidence in terms of his propensity to offend, and we had a reasonable circumstantial case against him. What we needed was the forensic evidence, the glue that would hold it all together. We went through every single exhibit and article that had been recovered, and they were all looked at again for DNA or anything that could help. But the body had been dumped in water and had been in there for a couple of days, so opportunities to harness DNA were diminished. It was a case of looking for another way." End quote. And that other way was to utilise the same skills that had helped solve the murder case in Austria almost half a century earlier, by enlisting the expertise of Professor Patricia Wiltshire, one of only a handful of forensic paleontologists in the world. She has been instrumental in assisting police in over 250 cases over a 25-year career. With her love of nature instilled in her by her grandmother, Professor Wiltshire has worked on cases ranging from the Sohn murders to the murder of 22-year-old Hull resident Joanne Nelson, whose story I will tell in a future episode. Summing up the role she plays, Professor Wiltshire stated in her memoirs, "People may not realise it, but pollen and spores can tell us stuff that DNA and fingerprints simply can't. Pollen isn't easily washed away, and it stays on people's clothes and shoes. If you walk on soil or vegetation, you inevitably pick it up." Humberside Police provided Professor Wiltshire with Christopher's clothing, from which she was able to recover traces of pollen on the little boy's jeans and trainers. She was also given the rock, which had been found with the body, and soil samples recovered from the suspect's property during searches that had taken place in 2002 and 2008. Detective Superintendent Higgins explained why they continued to pursue this line of investigation. What we were looking for was a link between the brick found in the body bag and the suspect's garden, and whether there was any possibility of tracing pollen that might also link Christopher to Reed's garden. We gave her access to all the samples we had recovered, including soil from sites across Hull, the house at Harpen Grove, Grantley Grove, and she came up with detailed findings. These showed conclusively the brick had emanated from the address at Grantley Grove, and Christopher's clothing had also been in contact with pollens from the garden. The pollen was on the front of his clothing and the soles of his shoes, so this shows at some point he had clearly been standing in the garden and latterly was face down in the garden. We knew at that point we had enough. Professor Wiltshire concluded a report for the police in 2011, and from this they were able to reconstruct what may have occurred on the 9th of March 1984. It was speculated that at approximately 9:15 that night, Melvin had driven to the home on Harpen Grove, where, whether by chance or by design, he found Christopher alone watching television. Somehow he was able to convince the boy to leave the property with him, which probably wouldn't have been a difficult task, given that Christopher had a close relationship with his uncle. Melvin then took the 9-year-old back to his house on Grantley Grove. What happened next are secrets Melvin has taken to the grave, but police are certain that while at his uncle's home, Christopher was sexually assaulted before being killed by several blows to the head. G.S. Higgins reflected on the circumstances that led to the murder, quote, "It seems something has happened that resulted in him being outside in the back garden. We would say he has been murdered there with a brick from the pond, which was then used to weigh the body down. Reed probably took him to the beck that night." In 2012, Christopher Laverack would have been 38 years old, but his life has been taken by a man whom his family loved and trusted. After all, he was family. A man considered to be a loving uncle, who had posed in pictures with Christopher, who consoled his sister when she went to identify her child's body. Melvin Reed was officially named as the man who had killed his nephew, a fact which must have done little to ease the family's pain. They had been deceived by one of their own. Christopher was gone, and the man responsible would never face justice for the crime. Recalling Pamela's reaction to the conclusion of the case, D.S. Higgins stated, quote, "She was aware of Reed's sexual offending, and she understands that this man was clearly the murderer. She knows his duplicity made him an expert in hiding his offending among the children. It was incredible he managed to keep it hidden for so long. This has been a very complex case to solve, but there can be few matters more important to pursue relentlessly than the murder of a child. Had Reed not died in prison, he would have been arrested for this murder following his release. He was an evil man, and a man wholly without remorse. I am satisfied that Christopher's family can have some sense of closure and understanding of what happened. This case has taken many years to resolve. We would all wish the evidence to convict was available sooner, and while Reed was still alive to face trial. However, that was not to be. Nothing of his sexual offending was known to the investigation team in the years immediately following the murder. The few officers still working on this case, between their other duties, have been determined to do all possible to solve the case and have simply refused to give up." End quote. Christopher's murder haunted the city of Hull for 28 years, and is an example in which the dogged determination of the police led to the case being resolved, but tragically without much closure for the family. It is well known that most murders are committed by family or someone close to the victim, but it doesn't make what happened to them any less shocking. Another development in this case has come about recently. In the early stages of the investigation, the police had focused in on Stephen Hines, due to the fact he was the last person to see Christopher. I have often heard officers say they have an intuition about someone, a feeling that that person is worthy of suspicion. Over the years it was believed that Melvin Reed had not acted alone, and I wonder whether they still considered Stephen as being complicit in the crime. This, however, has never been proven, but officers were correct to be wary of Stephen. His relationship with Kim ended in the 1990s, and he gave a number of interviews regarding the scrutiny he received from the police and the effect it had had on his life. But in 2014, 60-year-old Stephen Hines pleaded guilty to sexually assaulting 2 girls aged 8 and 10, despite him initially alleging that the girls had lied because they knew of his association with Christopher's case and that he had been a suspect. The prosecutor, Mr. Thackeray, remarked that the defendant had left his victims scarred for life, frightened and unable to sleep at night. In mitigation, the defence argued, quote, "Prisoners read newspapers, and his position in prison is powerless. These things are talked about, and he has become infamous. So he's vulnerable and frightened." Sentencing Stephen Hines to 5 years in prison, Judge Mark Berry stated, "You have ill health. You had a wretched upbringing. I accept that you will be vulnerable in the custodial settings, not only because of your ill health, but the 2 offences and publicity surrounding the case that you have been linked to. There is no evidence, however, you were involved in that." This case could lead to some very dark rabbit holes regarding speculation about what happened to Christopher. Had he been victimised by his uncle on occasions prior to the murder? And what, if anything, did Stephen know? But all this rumour and speculation just detracts from the fact that a 9-year-old boy was viciously murdered, and that his killer came from within his own family. It is impossible to imagine how anyone can heal from such an awful set of circumstances, and what suspicions, if any, the family had over the years. Christopher Laverack would have been 46 years old this year, but because of his uncle's actions, he will always be that fair-haired little boy with freckles across his cheeks and bright blue, inquisitive eyes. Thank you for joining me for episode 46 of It's Murder Up North. Episode 47 will be available next week. So in the meantime, keep an eye on those shadows.